Hi, everybody. I'm Jeff Weiss, co-chair of Steptoe's International Trade Policy Practice and lead of the firm's supply chain team. Welcome to Supply Chain University, where we dive into the legal, policy, and advocacy issues involving supply chains. To find out more, please visit our website at steptoe.com. On this episode, we're going to be talking about sustainable and ethical supply chains for fashion and textiles. And I'm really pleased to be joined by Marcy Zaroff, founder and CEO of Eco Fashion Corp. Marcy, thanks so much for joining us. We're really excited to have you here at Supply Chain University.
Thanks for having me, Jeff. Happy to be here.
Awesome. So you have been working to make supply chains in the fashion industry more ethical and sustainable, since the 90s. I'm curious, what did you encounter when you first started in the industry?
A lot of resistance. People thought I was crazy. I actually coined and trademarked the term eco fashion in 1995. And, people would look at me cross-eyed, like, how do you, those two worlds are dichotomous. They can't coexist. People who are into fashion and textiles could care less about the environment or social justice. And people who are thinking more consciously don't care about fashion. And I'm like, no, I'm that person. So I can't be alone. So a lot of resistance and a lot of naysayers. And I started the first sustainable fashion and home brand in North America called Under the Canopy, where we sourced all over the world. And I had to build supply chains. So probably my greatest roadblock in the early years was that it didn't exist, right? I came up with this concept. And as Jonathan Swift once said, vision is the art of seeing things invisible, right? So I saw where we needed to go, but it didn't exist. So I had to create it, which, now 30 years in the making, everybody's drinking the proverbial, sustainability and ethical Kool-Aid. So it's, everything I wish for, the time has come. So I'm excited. I pinch myself every day as I continue to be propelled in the industry.
So what do you think have been the key drivers in increasing, over the years, and increasing, consumer interest and manufacturer interest in ethical and sustainable supply chains?
So I think the first catalyst probably was the fact that consumers were starting to learn about food, organic, natural, healthier food. And in essence, when you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, our first basic need is food. But once you kind of plant that seed of consciousness in somebody and they start thinking about, oh, you mean the choices I'm making actually play a role in my state of health and well-being? What else? What's next? What more? And the second basic need in Maslow's hierarchy is shelter and clothing, right? So there's this evolution that's been happening in a lifestyle where the consumer, now that they've embraced healthier eating, is thinking about how to extend beyond food. And so that's where we're seeing, fiber in organic and natural is one of the fastest growing sectors. Non-food sectors actually is the fastest growing non-food sector, more than pet products and supplements and other products. The second catalyst is probably the internet. I would say the internet changed the game for our movement. When I started, we had to, educate, and it was really hard to reach a lot of people because, first of all, being on the shelves of a store, it's very hard to tell a sustainability story. And we didn't really have D2C other than mail order, which is how I started Under the Canopy, actually, through mail order catalogs. So we could tell the story. But once the internet really started to pick up momentum, the fact that you could pull the curtain back and unveil the human and environmental impacts by asking the questions, that go beyond food, right? What's in my food when the food farm to table movement? Now the questions became, what's in my clothing? How's it being made? Where's it being made? And a catalyst that sort of came on top of the internet was the fashion revolution movement, which was built on top of the Rana Plaza tragedy that happened in 2013, where 1,133 garment workers lost their lives instantly through a factory that collapsed in Bangladesh. And that led to an uproar at the consumer level, where really it was the first time I really saw just this massive wave of consumers starting to look at this industry, textiles and fashion, through a different lens, saying, business as usual cannot continue. This is not okay. And how do we change or shift this paradigm to be more transparent and more accountable to, the practices, both environmental and social?
So I think that's a really good segue into talking about Eco Fashion Corp. And I'm just wondering, how did you What was your plan to sort of change that paradigm through the business model you created?
Yeah. So because I've spent the past 30 years building supply chains all over the world with a very deep affinity in India, as well as a vision to scale manufacturing in America, I started with the first company or brand under the Eco Fashion Corp umbrella. We call ourselves a greenhouse of brands, kind of modeled over after the old school house of brands, except, of course, sharing all of our operational efficiencies, except we're a greenhouse. So MetaWare is really the engine of our whole company. And, you take this word meta, right? And we're going beyond. And that's really, the idea behind
Right.
MetaWare is we become a turnkey plug and play full package manufacturer, kind of like the Intel inside that takes our brand and retail partners through, this kind of buildable business model to be a solution provider, meet companies where they are and help them build and manage their supply chains from farm or raw material all the way through to logistics, freight, duties, and delivering right to their warehouse door. So we take a lot of the pain points out because an apparel item, a garment can change hands, as many as 7, 10, and even more times in a supply chain. There's a lot of hands that touch the product from the raw material up. So we manage that process and make sure that we're integrating compliance, inspections, quality control, certifications, and also storytelling. Because in today's world, not only has the internet changed the game, but social and digital media has become a powerhouse tool for brands and retailers to communicate the good things that they're doing. Unfortunately, there are always some bad seeds out there that talk about things and they're not really doing the work. But one significant difference I found in my career in the early years was a lot of these efforts around sustainability were driven by marketing departments, even the biggest retailers in America. Today, these efforts are being driven by sourcing, product development, and design teams. And they're actually telling the marketing departments to go away until they have something substantial to talk about, because transparency has now become fundamental in our industry. It's no longer an afterthought. And I always say, it's not even about staying ahead anymore. It's about not being left behind. So at Eco Fashion Corp, the key, foundation of our business is MetaWare. It is we have an office in India. It's a virtual manufacturing platform, and we're equipped to make knits, wovens, sweaters, denim, women's, men's, kids, pet, home, any category in the textile industry. We manage the process and have oversight, but it's about co-creation or eco-creation. And then we have 3 brands in our own portfolio at Eco Fashion Corp. One is direct to consumer, which is really a retail platform extension of MetaWare. And the other are 2 brands that we launched on QVC, exclusive for QVC, where I go on air and meet that consumer where they are. So it really becomes a voice and an extension of MetaWare and a showcase of what our capabilities are.
So I guess the big question is, what makes a supply chain sustainable, right? And what makes a supply chain ethical? So how do you define and measure that? I'm curious to know, what standards you use and how do you make sure that there's compliance with those standards?
Yeah, so there are a lot of spokes in the wheel of eco-fashion and a sustainable supply chain, right? So you look at waste. The fashion industry is one of the biggest, contributors to landfills, right? I mean, you look at the amount of disposable fashion through, the proliferation of fast fashion that's just ending up, polluting and ultimately landing, as if it's garbage. People are wearing it a few times and throwing it away. You look at water use, right? You have 20% of the world's freshwater pollution is actually coming from textile treatment and dyeing. You have climate change, which is front and center right now, probably, ever since COP26. One of the topics that the whole industry is really focused on, with an industry-wide commitment through an organization I'm on the board of called the Textile Exchange, a commitment to reduce our carbon footprint by 45% by 2030 at the minimum. So you've got all these companies, it's like all hands on deck to figure out, you've got an industry that you'll see the statistics vary, but it could be anywhere from 2% to 10% of the world's carbon footprint is coming out of the fashion industry. And the higher numbers include agriculture, transportation, and other sectors, which are part of our industry. Then it's energy use, right? How do we move towards more renewable energy? Because we use a lot of energy in textile manufacturing. Right. And then, of course, social justice, right? Because you talk about the Bangladesh, factory collapse, but all over the industry, there's a lot of subcontracting, and there's a lot of hands that touch the industry and a lot of women that touch the industry. But at the same time, it's the people that have been crammed down the supply chain, the farmers, the factory workers, making almost nothing, where they can't even put food on their table as retailers and brands increase their margins, right? They put more pressure on their supply chain. So we've got to address that, because sustainability is not just about planet or the environment. It's about people, right? Social and environmental. In fact, what I say as a business leader is in the 5 Ps of good business, it's about people, planet, profit, passion, and purpose. And so more and more companies, of course, are moving towards integrating purpose into their business models, because that's how you're going to get, retention of your employees. But also, this is the way of the future. This is what the millennials and the younger generations in the workforce are seeking. They want to be a part of doing well by doing good in the world, right? Not this broken personal and professional values have been very broken for decades. So I think where we are right now is you've got standards that, are kind of coming to the front lines. I'm a very big advocate for soil health, and, coming out of originally the food industry, that was where I started my career, connecting the dots from food to fiber. The highest standard for a textile in my eyes is called the Global Organic Textile Standard. It is about certifying textiles from farm to finished product that have at least 70% organic ingredients in them. But it really addresses sustainable agriculture. So when you talk about 1/3 of the world's textiles being made from cotton, right? And, tens of thousands of farmers around the world, hundreds of thousands of farmers that are growing cotton, we have to be looking at how can we grow cotton where it's protecting and building soil health. It's not depleting and degrading it as it is in the conventional system right now. So that's one big piece that I focus on. Another one is circularity, right? Because every synthetic garment in the history of mankind, right, the last 70 years or so, we've been creating textiles that technically never biodegrade. So where do they go? Well, they end up in the landfills. They end up shedding microfibers every time we wash them in our washing machines into the water systems, into the rivers, and ultimately into the ocean's ecosystems, where we're destroying the ocean's ecosystems through, not just plastic, our straws and our bags, but through plastic that's coming from textiles, right? Because when you shed microfibers, it's basically plastic, which is endocrine disruptors going into the water systems that are ultimately going into fish that we're eating, right? All these synthetics. So we now have to take the synthetics out of the system, the virgin synthetics. We have to figure out a way to keep them in the system, but also find solutions for microfiber pollution. So that's another big bucket that's, front and center. So you have the global recycled standard and a lot of the standards that are now focusing on how do we build a circular economy and recycle what we already have out there. And then you have the cradle to cradle standard, which is another standard that comes out of other industries, particularly the building industry. So in our world, it's called fashion positive, is the cradle to cradle vertical that focuses on textiles. And it looks at, material health and material reuse, which again, talking about the circular economy and versus a linear economy, as well as renewable energy, water stewardship, and social justice. So I'd say that the key touch points in summary are looking at the use of chemicals, water, waste, social justice, and energy. And those are the touch points that really are defining sustainability in our industry. Again, front and center, regeneration, circularity, and technology.
And so it sounds like, we have the key factors here, and then you have to make sure that there's compliance from one end of the supply chain to the other. And I noticed that, you just rolled out a blockchain technology platform to digitize your supply chain, starting at the farm, ending with the finished fashion products. how has that platform helped increase the visibility in the supply chain so that you can make sure that the products actually are meeting these standards?
Sure. So as I spoke about the catalyst being the internet and social and digital media, that was kind of our first big, vehicle that could allow for us to tell these stories and really validate the work that we're doing by virtue of embedding certifications right into our products at the finished product level. The next frontier is technology. How do we take the certifications to the next level where it's not just a manual, everything's on an Excel spreadsheet, or we're using paper transaction certificates, but now digitizing our supply chains on every level. And as I mentioned earlier, a garment can change hands so many times that rather than managing that process, through a manual, process, how do we do that through a blockchain technology where every step of the supply chain is loaded onto the blockchain, where our first frontier at Eco Fashion Corp is to tell the story of the journey of the product through a QR code on the product, where you scan the QR code at the finished product level and you can see every single place that product has traveled from its inception, including changing hands along the way to different factories. We're the first company to bring a fully transparent supply chain onto the blockchain that breaks up into all different players. It's not a single vertically integrated factory, which some factories have set up, where they can then say, okay, this is where we've gotten our material from. But, how deep you go into the supply chain and how broken a supply chain is gets very complex and very, very layered. And we now have it set up so that we can plug and play products into an already loaded, locked and loaded, supply platform, right? Which allows for many, many different configurations. The next frontier for us, now that we've actually launched our blockchain technology platform, is data. To bring data points that are all about carbon mitigation, water sequestration, water resilience, capturing water retention into the soil, and being able to measure and communicate that on the blockchain, those data points. And we're working on that now. So not only will we be able to do that at the product level, but we'll be able to consolidate that data across brands that want all of their products that they're making with us communicated, and then also across the entire platform. So we can talk about, that this is about true impact. It's about, this isn't a marketing proposition. When we talk about sustainability in our supply chains and ethical manufacturing, it's not just to say, we're, let's elevate the farmers and the factory workers superficially. This is about really making and affecting very positive change. And I just got back from India. I was there for a month. And, my happy place is really being in the farms and the factories and driving innovation and, and new ideas and new initiatives so that we can, leverage the power of fashion and textiles to drive the change that's very, very much needed in our industry.
I'm curious, how has COVID been affecting the business? I mean, we've had a lot of guests on the show, port directors and folks in different industries, and clearly the supply chain snarl has been impacting them. Just curious, what kind of impact, if any, this has had on supply and demand for sustainable fashion.
Yeah, well, they say law of the universe, right? Where there's a large front, there's a large back. So the large front is the pandemic, where I don't make light of all the suffering and, challenges of the pandemic. The gift that it gave us was an incredible level of awareness around sustainability at the personal and the professional level, that now it's game on, and companies have woken up and they're being held accountable by consumers, and also that next generation of employees that are saying, we want to be a part of something to turn our company around and make it more responsible, because, we can't keep going the way we're going. So, I think the health and wellness and sustainability movements, as well as regeneration, circularity, these topics I've talked about have all become accelerated. They've all come front and center, and I'm no longer banging on doors and, with huge resistance. I'm actually getting propelled. It's a little bit of be careful what you wish for. right? In ways that I just am blown away. I mean, everybody from mass to class has been, jumping on this train now. And the flip side, the dark side, or the other side of the coin is there's so much demand right now that, simple economics, right? Supply and demand. Supply is not keeping up with demand. And
Right.
obviously the biggest issues, the issues that we've had during the pandemic have magnified by, the lockdowns, which turned into bottlenecks, which turned into, pent up demand on this side, which turned into a disaster when it came to, freight and booking containers and booking, and logistics and, and raw materials. And then magnified even further is the fact that there was a massive fraud expose in China during the pandemic on cotton, where an area of China called Xinjiang, actually, it was exposed that the cotton growing in that region was grown using forced labor. And that created a major backlash globally because a fifth of the world's cotton comes out of that region of China. And so what happened was a huge number of companies, not only were they looking to diversify their supply chains, just, because they want to try from political lens for, just desire to now be more diversified to move out of China. But now all of a sudden you've got companies that are saying, whoa, we want to divest completely out of China because the risks here are becoming even greater. And so we've all of a sudden, as a company that's built a lot of our supply chains in India, we saw a huge influx of demand into India, which the two greatest cotton growing regions in the world are India and China, and of course the United States. So really, as companies have been, migrating out of China, they've been looking at India and the U.S. through a different lens, and we're seeing, a lot of attention and a lot of momentum growing there to offset all these challenges. And so, fraud became, navigating cotton sustainably is also another issue that kind of came front and center, because as more and more companies jumped on the sustainability bandwagon, obviously that led to knowingly and unknowingly missteps, where more brokers were making claims that, oh yeah, no, this is, organic or regenerative or sustainable or better. But what does that mean, right? Because if you don't understand what that means and you can't, really pull the curtain back and go in and sort of unpack, what's really going on, you could be vulnerable as a company, as a brand or retailer, to someone you're trusting across the world telling you something that might not necessarily be true. And so that's where certifications also become, very important. And looking at blockchain, how do we have those verifiable sources that can, come in at third party and validate the work that we're doing at every step in the supply chain. So, the pandemic created a lot of roadblocks because of logistical challenges, increased costs, because of, the demand outgrowing the supply for, things like cotton, things like, making in other countries. And then obviously the containers and the freight issues, logistics. I mean, there's just been a lot of bumps along the way. And the US banning cotton from that region also played a role in a big, backlog of cotton coming from other regions and production coming from other regions.
Yeah, no, we're very familiar with withhold release orders and following the relevant legislation, the recent Uyghur Act, and we're tracking. From our side, we're also seeing this. We're seeing a whole host of laws and regulations, final and proposed, in the U.S. and in Europe, that are either incentivizing or requiring greater supply chain due diligence. Right, whether it's carbon tariffs, import bans on products that aren't deforestation free, supply chain due diligence requirements. Right, you have the German Supply Chain Act, potentially a European Commission proposal later this year that is probably going to look fairly similar to that. As you mentioned, bans on importing goods allegedly made with forced labor. I was going to say, after all the work you've been doing, it must be very gratifying, like you're saying, to see things changing and these new requirements, being rolled out, and you're not having to knock down the door anymore. People are coming to you. I'm curious, sort of last question, looking ahead, 5 to 10 years. I mean, what's next, do you think, for sustainable supply chains for fashion or for
Well,
food?
one thing that is kind of almost mind-boggling to me because of the journey I've been on for so long is the state of New York. You may be familiar with the fact they just released the Fashion Sustainability and Social Accountability Act in January, a bill that is out there now that would hold all businesses, all fashion and textile companies over 100 million in sales, which is, most of the global companies who have a footprint in New York, which they all do, to actually map their supply chains. And at least 50% of their supply chains have to be fully transparent, and they have to make science-based target commitments towards climate change mitigation. So, all of a sudden, this is like moving into a layer of law that, if this bill passes, is going to be, light a major fire. And I think what's happening is these brands and retailers are getting positioned now and poised for, this happening. And they're starting to think about, whoa, wait a minute, what do we need to do? And where we're trying to be helpful at MetaWear and Eco Fashion Corp is they are making these commitments like, hey, we're going to be, 30% less carbon footprint by 2025, or we're going to be all sustainable cotton by 2025, or we're going to be whatever the commitments they're making. Then they're trying to figure out, how do we get there? Right. And there aren't a lot of places that people can go or companies can go to get that support because it is so complex. And that's where I feel like at this stage of my career, when you say like, what's next for me? Is 1 + 1 = 11, right? We're stronger together than we are apart. So for me, it's about co-creation. I can't hit my meta vision, which is to make the norm the alternative and the alternative the norm, without everybody being at the table. So it's, as I said earlier, it's all hands on deck. And how I can serve others. I'm at the table now, really building my teams. We have an office in India. We're opening a smart factory in the US next year. That's going to be all a factory of the future, really leveraging all the amazing new technologies that are out there and partnerships so that we can have, a diversified or, supply chain strategy for our partners, both overseas and domestic, because I do think the next chapter, if I was to say, what's next, it is the driving of technology to help support onshoring. I think the pandemic has made us all realize we can't be fully dependent on overseas production anymore. Yes, we need it for scaling, production from a cost standpoint, but with the demand that consumers, the younger generations, are looking for, quick, on demand, customized, right. They're looking at things through a different lens. They want fast, they want what they want. And so I think that's leading to a lot of opportunity. And, we've got our finger on the pulse of, again, modern technology and how we can leverage that to drive the next chapter in the industry where we can all wear the change we wish to see in the world.
Well, thanks so much, Marcy. I mean, this is all really exciting. And I've learned a lot. Really appreciate your coming on and hearing your insights on these issues, and looking forward to seeing, continued growth in the sector, and can't wait to see what you do next.
Thank you so much. Thanks again for having me, and have a wonderful weekend.
Awesome. So that's it, everyone, for this edition of Supply Chain University. You can find this and all of our videos at steptoe.com. You can also find us on YouTube, where you can like and subscribe. So thanks, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, everyone.